now we're speaking about the establishing of the anti-corruption court. There is the conditionality with that, but all of a sudden we have the president and the prosecutor general not really pushing forward. So this is the Ukrainian debate. But without going into the details, do you think there is a real trust into President Poroshenko and leadership of the country from what you talk to the expert, the Western experts? Does he sound like repetitive? He's very good in criticizing Russia, but do you think there were substantial answers on really what people want to hear from where the country is moving?
Well, I mean, I think, by the nature of his position, he will always give highly political answers, that is to say, extremely boring ones, and trying to say as little as possible. Now, Poroshenko is an interesting one because I followed his career since he was elected. Now, when he was elected by quite a majority. He was seen as, by many, the best of a bad bunch. There wasn't huge enthusiasm for him. Also, he's an oligarch. He's a man of the establishment. I mean, in his case, it's chocolate, so it's more benign than most people made their money. But nonetheless, I mean, look, it's a variety of conflicting opinions when I speak to people about Poroshenko. Some people still think he's for the best. Other people say that he's, hasn't moved fast enough on reforms. He hasn't delivered on his reforms. But as we've discussed previously, I think you have to look at what he's facing, which is a Ukrainian state that since independence has been based financially on corruption. And this takes a generation to remove. It doesn't take 3 years.
But there are, for a while, talks about the Ukrainian fatigue.
Yeah.
And is it also the fatigue on Poroshenko or also on Ukraine? And particularly, that's why I mentioned that, you can't listen to Poroshenko. He's telling the same things all the time. So how it goes together?
Look, I think politicians say the same thing a lot. I mean, Donald Trump's been talking about building a wall since he first entered politics. So, I mean, it's not that. I think unfortunately, and it's very sad to me as someone who cares about Ukraine, that there is Ukraine fatigue. When I was here in 2014, I mean, it was the biggest subject, global geopolitical subject. I mean, people could not get enough of Ukraine. And, you see this at the YES conference. You talk to Natalia about the YES conference taking the temperature. But it also takes the temperature of external interest in Ukraine. And, the first year, 2014, every major newspaper, American and British, had a correspondent here. This year there were far fewer. It's still got many great people from around the world, but I think simply, it's Ukraine fatigue. And unfortunately, in our industry, as they said, if it bleeds, it leads. If the war starts up again intensely, then you'll see a return of interest. But unfortunately for now, there is Ukraine fatigue. I don't think you can blame that on Poroshenko. I think it's just the way the news cycle works in our social media age. People have tiny attention spans.
And another quote where I'd like to bring is the quote by Prime Minister Groisman. He doesn't speak that often to foreign media in particularly, and he's not that outspoken personality. So that was interesting to listen to what he was answering.
We see that through the adoption of one law about privatization, that these are revolutionary laws submitted by the government. This will provide for the development of the national economy. To break something is not to build something. You can break something very quickly, but the effort to construct comes later. I am deeply convinced that every month, every year, people will start to feel that the situation is improving. There is a lot of pessimism in society now, and I understand these people because they have been suffering for years. But I see the prospects for the development of the Ukrainian economy. I see new jobs. We are going to new markets now. We had to leave the traditional Russian markets and switch to new markets. Today, the European Union is responsible for more than 44% of trade. Not long ago, it was only 37%. We have new institutions to support investment, to support Ukrainian exports. We are putting stimulating programs into our draft budget that are able to provide for the quality support of Ukrainian agriculture. We have a lot to do to stabilize the situation, but we know how to do it.
Fact is, he is now in the country, and as we understand it, he plans to be here in Kyiv next week. So my simple question is, what are you and the government and the authorities in Ukraine going to do about this situation?
Nothing. I don't know what to do in such a situation. What to do with populace? Let society deal with it. Whatever I do as Prime Minister together with my government, I will do in the name and on behalf of Ukrainians.
That was an answer of the Ukrainian Prime Minister on what would happen when the next week Mikhail Saakashvili, former Georgian president and Odessa governor, would come back to Kyiv. That is also an issue, of course, and that's what I heard also from a lot of people. So how the community you were speaking also was discussing that. Are you supporting Saakashvili, speaking against him? He was the guest of this conference for the last years.
I remember that. I remember it well. Yes, he was quite a fated guest. Look, the Saakashvili issue is really, you know, it's really very heated. And I've seen on social media lots of friends, Ukraine experts, you know, American Ukrainians, Canadian Ukrainians, really debating this issue and really getting angry. But I think, there has to come a point where you cannot just crash through the borders of a sovereign state. You know, you can't behave like that. You know, I mean, he was stateless. I mean, perhaps he hasn't been treated as fairly as he should have been, or he thinks he should have been. But you can't crash through the borders of a state with a mob. I mean, you just don't behave like that. I mean...
The answer of Prime Minister was, we'll do nothing. And that's exactly probably, there was this open question and it remains open. And I would like to go also to the economy more in depth, and also the what is happening with the reformers in the government, because they are always the faces of the Ukrainian reforms, but sometimes we can believe that there is some difference between what is shown for the external audience and what is happening on the ground. So we would like to give you a quote of Paul Krugman, the Nobel laureate on economy, who had traveled to Kyiv this time, and also the former economy minister Abromavicus.
As later appeared, our independent thinking was perhaps too independent for someone's sake, and it was not possible really to carry on. But with my resignation, I believe I paved the way for less interference into the work of the colleagues that stayed. I see people now rallying, good people rallying around the Prime Minister, certainly around the Minister of Healthcare, Minister of Finance, a few other sort of islands of reforms, of progress and of hope. But again, we would need that type of situation to prevail in more institutions to make a bigger impact. One of the difficult things when I was in the government was to really, and the biggest mistakes was that all of those new Ukraine, so to say, representatives had difficulties uniting, and therefore we were taken out one by one. And clearly, the bad guys have no problems, working for the common goal. The good guys have always problems uniting. Who's going to be the first on the stage? Who's going to be first on the list to speak? Therefore, it is very clear that we're still in the middle of a crisis of values.
It's actually been quite impressive, given the nature of the crisis that Ukraine went through in 2014-15. To see the economy stabilize. It's not a roaring boom, but at least off the bottom, some of the danger signals have really receded. They've gone from red lights to yellow lights in terms of budget deficits and inflation. And what's striking, given the theme of what I've been talking about, is that how did Ukraine do that? It did that pretty much in a familiar way. The Ukrainian turnaround looks a lot, for someone with my background, looks a lot like successful reforms in developing countries that have happened many, many times. It looks like reforms that worked in Latin America, getting away from a commitment to an unsustainable exchange rate, letting a combination of depreciation and rebalancing domestically bring you back into sustainable territory. It doesn't solve all your problems. If you want to ask, how do you achieve really major economic growth? How do you really achieve an economic takeoff? The answer is we don't know, and we never have. So in that sense, things have not changed. But if we ask, do we know how to at least produce a situation which is not boiling over? We do, and Ukraine has done that.
David, so a rather optimistic view from the world-known economist, but grew kind of pretty pessimistic view from the Ukrainians who were trying to deal with the issues. So you feel that there is some disbelief in the young reformers? That's what the former Minister of the Economy said, that they didn't make it, So do you think there is a hope that this new generation is something, the Western investors would trust?
Well, I think, a lot of hope was placed in this generation of reformers because obviously the one of the many things about Maidan is it galvanized civil society and it created, activists who became politicians. Mustafa from your own channel is an example of that, and so there is a generation, people like Hannah Hopko, people like that, who did great work before, who are now in the Rada. But I think that, it's possible that too much expectation was put on their shoulders because, again, we go back to problems that are entrenched and generational.
And what would be the maybe untold stories? We're having an opportunity here that you think the West or the foreign audience doesn't get from Ukraine enough.
The untold story. It's not untold, but I think people need to focus on what's happening in the East more again. It seems to have dropped off the radar, but people are still getting hurt there. It's calmed down a lot. Other than that, I think that people need to understand Kyiv. I saw recently it was voted one of the most unlivable cities in the world. It's complete nonsense. Kyiv is it's one of the most dynamic and thriving European capitals that I've been to, which is why I come here so often. So I think there needs to be a general level of knowledge about Ukraine, not just politically, but culturally and socially. That's what I feel. I feel that it has a warped image in the public consciousness. It's thought of as a place of war for obvious reasons, or a grim Soviet former republic, which is very far from the case. It's a wonderful place, and I think people need to do that. And it's a place with a lot of potential. It has a lot of natural resources. This country can feed can feed Europe basically. It has a lot going for it. The problem with Ukraine is the people, is the politicians. The actual landscape, the soil, everything that you have is great. But as is so often the case, the politicians, although they're getting better, for 20 years, essentially stole from the country.